Hi and welcome to the Tes Leadership Forum webinar series with me, your host, Dan Worth. In this session, we're going to be discussing and debating an issue that is increasingly on the agenda in multi-academy trusts up and down the country regarding which funding model to use, top slicing or GAG pooling. More on what those two terms mean for the uninitiated shortly. Joining us today for this debate, I'm delighted to introduce a fantastic panel of speakers to offer their views. They are Rowena Hackwood, the Chief Executive Officer of the Australia Academy Trust, formed of 26 schools in South Yorkshire and Cambridgeshire. Dan Morrow, the Chief Executive Officer of the Dartmoor Multi-Academy Trust, formed of 18 schools across Devon. Sarah Lovell, the Chief Operating Officer of the Cabot Learning Federation, formed of 22 schools across the wider Bristol area. And Wayne Norrie, the CEO of the Greenwood Academies Trust, formed of 37 schools across Nottinghamshire, Northamptonshire and Lincolnshire and beyond. Before we dive into our debate, we're just going to watch a very quick video explaining the two terms in a bit more detail to help get everyone on the same page for our discussion. The Academy Trust Handbook dictates that a multi-academy trust and its board are responsible for all funding that it receives from government. Each trust may choose how they allocate some of that funding between schools. Predominantly, there are two types of models for this. The first is called top slicing. In this model, the school receives its general annual grant direct from government. A percentage of that general annual grant is then retained to run the trust's centralised functions, such as finance, HR, school improvement, and estates and facilities. The percentage is usually around 3 to 5% depending upon the size and scale of the central services and what is retained at the school level. The second model is called General Annual Grant Pooling, usually termed GAG pooling. In this model, the trust pools all the general annual grant money for the schools and then allocates this money out to each school based on their own formula. This can mean funding stays the same, but usually schools see funding rise or fall as the trust decides where money will be best allocated, such as if a struggling school in the trust would benefit from increased funding to improve staffing levels or some other resource. It also helps to even out funding on a per pupil basis, as some trusts may operate across different local authorities where the GAG funding rates will vary. Top slicing has generally been favoured, but there are growing moves towards GAG pooling, as many see it as a logical step in realising the benefits of the economies of scale and collaboration between schools that being part of a multi-academy trust is built on. I hope that's proved really useful, and no doubt the terms will become even clearer as we go into our debate. So without further ado, I'm going to go to each of our panel members now and ask them to introduce themselves and their trust, and perhaps most importantly, which funding model they use. Over to you, Rowena.
Well, it's lovely to be here and to have the opportunity to talk about this, which I think is a really important topic that many chief executives, chief operating officers, CFOs are really wrestling with at the moment, particularly as the sizes of our trusts grow in the context of lots of schools now becoming academies, joining multi-academy trusts, and that's growing. And I do think it creates a really interesting challenge for us all to think about how we get the best use of our resources in an environment which is increasingly resource constrained. So what we do in our trust is that we've historically always pooled our reserves, and we take the view that pooling our GAG and allocating it out based on what we would describe as a fairness model, so based on a ratio of the adults that a school needs to the number of students that it has, but also bearing in mind that some schools are naturally more efficient or inefficient than others based on their geographic area, their historic pay bill, the efficiency of their building, the local birth rate, and a whole heap of other factors which are not actually determined by the children that are in the building at that time. We take a view that if we use a common model, we value every child's education at an equal value. And therefore we allocate budgets in that way. What we do on top of that is we contextualize on the basis of pupil premium, which is allocated fully out to our individual schools based on the pupil premium amount that they attract. And we also look at the contextual needs of each school and take a decision with the leaders in that school about what else that school needs to layer on top of that core GAG pooling model and funding for fairness. So that's our sort of basic approach. And I think probably even when we describe a not GAG pooling approach, the principles that we adopt probably in the sector were somewhat similar.
Yeah, that's a great answer, touching on lots of points there we'll probably come back to as we go forward. So yeah, thank you for that. Dan, I could see you nodding along with a lot of that then. Tell us a bit about your trust then and the model you use, and I suppose why as well a little bit.
So at Dartmoor Multi-Academy Trust, we adopted GAG and income pooling 2 years ago. And it's really for three important reasons. The first is our values as a trust based on the cooperative movement are centered around equity as well as equality, and it's making sure that we can smooth out some of the inefficiencies and ineffectiveness in school funding within our organisation and have the ability to match resources to specific needs and the contextual aspects of each individual school, as Rowena's just already said. I think the second thing for us is being in a GAG pooling world means actually we empower our principals far more to work as a collective and to bring the hive brain to solutions and to looking at where we find ourselves within resource allocation on a year to year. But it gives us a greater ability, I believe, to be in that strategic planning space of 2 to 3 years, which is really important, I think, in such a volatile and uncertain context and environment, that we're able to keep some key principles in place and therefore work to those principles as a collective. And I think the third thing is we do look at curriculum-led financial planning as a methodology, and the GAG pooling aspect is able to give us, therefore, some flexibility in how we can look to improve the outcomes in individual schools, but also work collectively around effectiveness and efficiency. As Rowena's already said, we are in a resource-constrained environment, and that's increasingly the case. The level of need is increasing exponentially, the level of resourcing less so. And therefore, I think it gives the ability to do more with less, because we prize that effectiveness, but we also prize the democratic aspects of principals' voice and contribution into how we spend our resources as one large family of schools.
Again, some really interesting points coming up there around, like, the current economic situation we're in, and the fact you went to there quite recently, a couple of years ago. Maybe that was an unintentional benefit that you find yourselves in now. Again, hopefully we'll have time to come back and talk about that a bit more shortly. Wayne, I understand you use a different model, although I could see you nodding to a lot of that. So maybe some of the ways you operate, you think, cover similar issues. And again, tell us a bit about your trust and how you will operate.
I mean, I don't think the issues about equality and equity are different in our model to what Maria and Dan says. We work in a very interesting context, and we work over 8 local authority areas. And within those, there is inequality in the funding of those children. So, for example, our children in Nottingham get £1,000 more per pupil than our children in Northamptonshire. And there's 2 ways of looking at that equality and the equity, isn't there? Because basically, I could say all my children across the trust should have the same funding. But if you're a child in Nottingham who goes to a GAT academy in Nottingham, why should you have less money spent on you than all the other children in Nottingham that don't go to a GAT academy? So it's a really interesting dilemma when you're working at scale among more than one local authority, which doesn't mean GAG pooling can't happen, but with the inequalities in that funding is something that we have to really consider and look for. It's also around the model of how we believe that leadership works in academies. So we don't have a one-size-fits-all approach at Greenwood at all. We have 38 different academies, different curriculum models, and it's about the leadership and empowering leadership of those schools. So what we would do is we give authority to principals to make decision-making around, which I'm not saying that other MATs don't, but part of that for me is to be a principal, you manage your own budget within the money you get in, and that's part of your delivery. That's part of your expectation of being a leader at GAP. Now, as Rowena will know, Rowena and I have had loads of conversations about this, and I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer here, actually. But I think in terms of it's the rationale and the driver. So a few years ago when I took over, we didn't GAG pool, we didn't pool reserves. We now do pool reserves. Actually, in the pooling of reserves, it's made a bigger impact actually in the pooling of GAG for us. But I also think it's really important that nothing is forever, is it? And I think every year we come back to this discussion around, shall we GAG pool? Shall we top slice? How much do we do? But it actually not GAG pooling has worked for us from taking a high number of academies that are in deficit budgets and in category of concern to having a very few, one academy now that is in a deficit budget, because we've managed that situation in individual academies. And the trajectory now of having no school that's inadequate in the trust, when previously 4 or 5 years ago we had knocking on 15 schools that were. So I think it's a really interesting model, but we only talked about GAG pooling yet again at my executive team last week to say, actually, are we right in the current situation? So we're in a watch and learn situation here. But for us, that autonomy or authority of running your own budget has come hand in hand with improving individual schools. If there was a national funding formula, which we know apparently there is going to be and one's coming, that might make our position very different. And that's where we work on that basis at GAP.
Yeah. Okay. Really interesting again, and I think you'll pick up there some of the themes and the rationales that to your decision making are actually the same. We're the same sort of thought process, and then arriving at a different model, which maybe is a sigh of relief to some people watching this and realizing that you can end up at a different position. It doesn't mean you're like you say, you're not right or wrong. You're just what works best for you. Sarah, certainly last but not least, how do you operate? And again, are you looking at similar, like looking at changes? Do you regularly sort of have to get together as a group and think, is this the right model for us that we're using at the moment?
Great, thank you, Dan. So for our trust, it's all about making sure that we deliver value for money, i.e. that our pupils get a fantastic experience in our trust. And similarly to what others have just said before me, it's a very topical subject at the moment because MATs are exploring growth, there's mergers, there's movement happening in our sector. So it's how do we have a really robust financial model that still delivers on great outcomes for our pupils, but also make sure, as Wayne said, that our principals are really empowered to know what money they have available to run their schools. And that's a really important perspective of our trust, that we empower our principals to do so. So we pulled our reserves back in 2018 because we recognised at that point that we wanted our reserves to support all of our 12,500 pupils equally, not just those that historically had some reserves and some didn't. So it was all about making sure that we have pooled reserves to support the whole of the trust. At the moment, we do have a top slice contribution model that runs essential services. However, what we have done with other areas is we've looked at how we spend our IT and effectively pooled how we manage our IT budget. We're looking at estates and thinking about how we manage that really well across our trust. And also we have worked flexibly with some of the grants that have come in, and we've had a number of different grants that have come in over the last few years, either COVID related or more recently there were some announcements around grants, and thinking about how we use those innovatively to perhaps support school improvement priorities in some of our schools more so than others. But I think it's very timely. I think it is for the whole point that Rowena, Dan and Wayne have said. For us, we're in 3 local authorities, and it doesn't sit comfortably with me that if you're a pupil in one local authority, you get more funding than another. So when the national funding formula does come in, that will be hopefully help to even up the playing field. But I think it's very topical and something that we will continue to explore as a trust, because it's about evening up that funding and making sure that we still protect those additional educational need factors like the free school meals, pupil premium, making sure that definitely follows the pupil, but thinking about that basic level of funding and how we make sure that all pupils in our trust receive a similar to meet their needs.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that you all sort of picked up on that point there about the fairness idea and equity and inequality, and obviously not an easy thing to get right. You can say you want to do that, but then to Wayne's point about, well, actually, is it fair then if people in one region gets less than a school down the road that isn't in your trust, even though they would have normally? You can see suddenly how very quickly it becomes a difficult decision to make, and not so you we'll just use that model. A point I want to come back to, I think, just to go back on some things then, is autonomy of head teachers came up quite a bit there, and that's something that would strike me as quite an important thing. Is particularly if you change model, you have to say to them, look, it's going to be different. You might end up getting more money, you might get less, but here's the rationale, here's what we want to do with it. Dan, you said you went through this change a couple of years ago. Was that a conversation you had to have your heads? Was there any sort of pushback? Did people go with it? I mean, how did you sort of play that out to make sure that, no watching this thinking, we might do that, we're worried about the conversation. Is it okay, or does it have to require some explanation?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. So we did it as an entire consultation with our principals, our governors and trustees, and indeed representatives from local boards and staff. I would say initially there was some pushback about the concept, and it was actually centered, as Wayne discussed, around the concept of autonomy and about the totality of role of being a principal and what that really derives. As we got into the discussions and really started to talk about 2 aspects, firstly, the parameters around it, which I think were reassuring that this was about changing the voice and the ability of principals to influence. It wasn't about taking it away. And so our principals still have a very important part in sitting all together as one team and discussing allocations each year. And again, as a cooperative trust, democracy and solidarity are 2 very important values to us. And so we centered the work very much in our values proposition and who we are. And I think that reassured a number of principals that this wasn't a sort of power grab by the centre, if you like, of funding and allocations. The second thing is we are quite unapologetic within the trust that our vision for principals is to be the drivers for learning and teaching. and to be principally involved in, therefore, that aspect of the role. And I think one of the true benefits and liberations of multi-academy trust is our ability to really centre expertise in each area of the way we operate. And I know that the feedback from a number of principals following the adoption of both reserve and GAG pooling has been that they feel liberated to manage budgets without having to worry about the whole aspects of finance in a way that could just become another job where they were inevitably undertaking quite a lot of training and quite a lot of work that would take them away from what I consider to be their core purpose. We don't really talk about autonomy in the trust in the same way, because for me, it's a bit of an adult-centered word. And that's not a criticism at all, actually, about the way we look at these things. But Rowena and I discussed when we've worked together on this previously, I think the fact that both of us have come into education from other sectors gives us a slightly different view on, therefore, how we centre entitlement and centre expertise. And I would rather have fully qualified financial experts who are managing budgets and managing the process of budget setting to support and enhance the work of our school leaders than asking actually every principal to wear so many hats that it's difficult to really know always whether or not they are having the time, the ability and the skill set to drive their core purpose.
That's a very interesting point, isn't it? Because I think that's true in a lot of sectors, isn't it? Is that you get promoted up the ranks for the thing you're good at, but then you end up taking on skills and requirements that are not what you ever were good at because you never had to do them. But suddenly you're managing budgets and things. It's like, hang on, this isn't why I got here. I got here because I was good at X, Y, and Z. And to your point, if you can take that away a little bit, so just focus on what you're really good at, what you came into the profession to do, probably, that's going to work better. I think, Rowena, you'd be good to bring you in there because obviously, again, I saw you and Dan do a talk on this kind of issue at the Academy show back in November. So you're clearly aligned in a lot of this. Again, some of those points that Dan brought up, again, how have you approached them around, head teacher autonomy and so forth? And again, making that work for them and the trust as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much share Dan's point of view, and I actually think autonomy is a really unhelpful pre-multi-academy trust word, because what we're creating when we create trusts is we are absolutely by definition not creating autonomy. We're creating family, we're creating collective accountability, shared governance, all of these kinds of things which are fundamental to the definition of what a multi-academy trust is. I think one area that is really underexplored within the sector, which Dan has touched upon, though, is what the role is of a principal when they are in the middle, actually, of a management and leadership structure within a multi-academy trust. So all of us run trusts with 20-ish plus schools in them, and all of us will have some kind of management and leadership structure which sits above a head teacher with some accountabilities for the performance, financial and otherwise, of that school. Some of us may have 2 or 3 layers above that. And actually, therefore, thinking about what autonomy really means within a context where that individual is within a management structure is just an area which people feel incredibly nervous about talking about and unlocking, because we have this historic idea of an autonomous school leader, which just doesn't make any sense in the context where that individual is a leader within an organizational structure. So I think that for me is the key thing here that we need to unpack. In my previous trust, we went a long way further than GAG pooling in the way that Dan and I do it in our current roles. And we looked simply at what is it that the principal needs in order to be an expert in the delivery of teaching and learning within their school. So what are the educational support and educational supplies and services budget heads that should be delegated to the school according to a common fair funding model? Everything else, which actually accounts in many cases for around 40% of your total budget, which in my trust is around £40 million a year, is actually things that are in common. We don't want 26 different Wi-Fi contracts. We don't want 24 different photocopier contracts we fall over ourselves in terms of procurement law. This isn't just about, everybody defaults to, we should procure together and save money. This is about expertise and really thinking about valuing all of our professions within a multi-academy trust, whether they're finance professionals, estates professionals, whether they're teaching professionals and so on, and making sure that we fund those pathways and those expertise areas appropriately within the context of the overall funding envelope that we have. So I think that would be my key contribution to this discussion, really, around autonomy, is just a stop and pause and ask ourselves whether we really do have a clear view about within our trusts what it means to be a principal and how that role is defined. And believe you me, Dan, there will be as many definitions of that as there are multi-academy trusts in the country. And so it should be. But what I don't think we've quite got to grips with yet is having the courage to have that conversation. And I think as a result of that, that's where many multi-academy trusts trip over, because schools join trusts thinking that they're going to have some degree of autonomy within the system. But then it turns out it isn't quite what they imagined in the first instance. And not having the honesty in the conversation, that's where I think we go wrong.
Well, it's a very good point, actually, isn't it? Because you're right, because in some way, the whole premise of joining a trust is that you aren't going to be autonomous in the sense that you are going to have people above you and around you. But that's one of the positives. That's what you should be selling it, is like, look, you're not on your own. You can come to someone else. You can get help. And if we're sort of saying, but if we're too focused on trying to reassure people about autonomy, it's like you're mis-selling one of the elements that isn't part of it. But and I can see why it's funny. We all use the word, I think, in a way, because it's such a natural word to use. But I think a lot of people there will probably know exactly what you're talking about and why we need to talk about it. And the point that did come up as well that I want to come to Sarah on, which was talking about using the expertise we have in our trusts to make things work the best for everyone, like not having multiple contracts. I mean, Sarah, you're a CFO. You are a person with financial expertise. That's you touched on about how you started to look at pooling on certain things in the trust and perhaps not others. Again, then with you and your role, presumably your team around you, who can do, who presumably can bring those skills to bear. Again, do you think that's something where people like yourself almost do have that need, that right, whatever it is, to step up and say, look, give this to us. We can make it work best for you. We can make it financially prudent and economies of scale. You get on with running your schools. And you think sometimes it's almost just having the, I don't know what it is, confidence, but just recognize that that's the benefit of the trust. Let us do these things. You focus on teaching, and it's just got to keep taking that conversation forward.
I absolutely agree with you, Dan, and that's very much the cornerstone of our trust. So I oversee what we call our professional services, which are effectively the services that support our principals to be able to run their school and support the trust to run. So we invested a number of years ago in accountants to manage the budgets, for HR professionals to support with employee relations or other areas that might be important. We have a health and safety team, we have an IT team, we have a cybersecurity lead. So we've invested in a whole range of different services within our trust, because we recognise that by bringing some of these in-house and some are outsourced, but bringing those services in-house, that our principals are able to draw on those services from the central team and be able to then focus on what they need to focus on to run their school. So as Rowena said, there's absolutely no point in having 24 contracts or 22 contracts for different things. One, because you're breaching procurement regulations, which we don't want to do as a trust. But secondly, who manages those contracts? Because if they're locally managed, it makes it much harder again to focus on teaching and learning. So, for example, we have one catering contract, and that's managed centrally. Cleaning contracts, all of those sorts of things. Yes, there is local input. There has to be, of course. But by taking that burden away and using experts to manage those contracts, that's really helped us as a trust, and something that our principals really benefit from and appreciate.
And is that then sort of, where are you on that journey, might you say? Is this fairly recent, or have you been doing it sort of step by step, or are you looking to accelerate forward and do more of this now for any particular reason, like particularly maybe in the cost of living situation and making the most of your money go as far as it can?
Most of our large-scale contracts we manage centrally as such. We have gone through a procurement process, everything from supply as well, so agency supply. There are some local contracts that we'll probably explore in the future, but we have a procurement officer who oversees all of those for us. So it's been something that's been in place now for several years, actually, and has been working really well for us.
Dan, I think there is a really important point. I know you want to come on to Wayne here, but there's a really important point in terms of this topic of GAG pooling, which is that I don't think you'll get anybody objecting actually in a multi-academy trust to a central procurement of a common strategy, something like a catering contract. The question is, what do you then do with that? Does that mean you pool the money to buy that contract, or do you go through some artificial process of recharging that back out to schools to give some kind of ghostly remnant of it feeling like the school's control? And I think that that's where part of the argument around GAG pooling is, should that money for catering contracts, photocopier contracts, broadband contracts be centrally placed and managed, or should we have this idea that we give some semblance of control by passing it back out to schools under some charging, recharging wooden dollars type of arrangement. And I don't think that's an area that's being talked about at present.
Yeah.
And if I may, just because the trust I led before this also embraced GAG pooling for the same reasons. And it's as Rowena said, actually, for us, it was about transparency, because the absolute truth is we were pretty much doing it anyway. We just weren't stating we were doing it. And we are holding principals and leaders to account for budgets, which actually, because of central procurement and economies of scale aspects of the way we operated, there were vast chunks of their budget that were already well beyond their control. And therefore, I think exactly what I'm saying, I agree with Rowena completely. The reason we embraced it at Dunmore in the way we did was this is what happens in a day-to-day reality, how we package it, how transparent we are about it. And exactly as Rowena said, it is better, in my opinion, to pool it and to be open from the start on, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, and this is the efficiencies that it therefore drives across the family of schools, as opposed to creating all of these somewhat tortuous recharge models, which therefore give a veneer of autonomy, but actually there is no autonomy in that sense, that very few of the principals will have been involved in the procurement process or making those choices, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so for me, it's about just revealing the reality of how we now operate within this system. And it's not something I think we need to be apologetic for. But I also agree with Rowena. I think that there's potentially some political or even hubristic points around this that make it quite a challenge to therefore be as candid as I think we do need to be. But I suppose I take this back to the Nolan principles and the need to just be very open and transparent in the way we operate, in order that what we're not doing is selling it as something different than it is, actually, and taking some pride in the way we operate.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, thank you again. Really interesting points all coming up from everyone here, and I think, Rowena, appreciate your sort of input there to sort of make sure we're clear there, because I think you're right. It's that, and then Dan following up by sort of saying it might look like one thing, but if it's already operating a different way, why not just move to that model and make it work as best as it can? Wayne, thank you for waiting patiently for your turn to come in. Though there's a lot there probably that maybe you agree. You were nodding along again, I could see, but maybe also bits where you're operating differently, where maybe you think it's different because of the geographic spread of your schools, and again, like come back on which bits you want to, really, I think.
It's not an either or, Dan, is it?
Yes.
Because actually at Greenwood, we don't have 25 different photocopying contracts. We do exactly the same as everybody else around the table does. We just don't do GAG pooling. So, I will say to my principals, for those of us old enough to remember, Woolworths and the pick and mix, this trust isn't a pick and mix. You can't pick all the bits you like of it and leave the other bits behind. But I have a different view on accountability, because essentially this is children's money that is placed with me to be the guardian of. It's not trust money, it's not Academy's money. So we're very clear, we take 5.5% of your GAG, of your children's money, into us to provide a service, and we provide a service for those children. So we do make decisions in-house so it's not about autonomy, it's not about a recharge, it's about a fee, if you like, for being part of us. And therefore we live in a perverse world that they pay me to be their boss. So it's their schools that pay me to be their boss, and actually they can hold me accountable. So we're very clear about the amount of money we're taking from an academy and what we need to deliver back to that academy and community. And there's a very clear line in my mind about responsibility. Now, I also think it's really interesting in the maturity of your trust, the size of your trust, the location of the trust, and the difficulties you find yourself in as a trust. So our journey at Greenwood, we were minus 0.7 at P8 when we took this journey on. We'd done a whole number of schools in special measures, a whole schools in deficit budget, and a whole issue around leadership and management. If we were starting afresh now as a trust, might I do something differently? Might I look at GAG pooling? Probably, actually, we might have done. But at the moment, we've developed a model that is really working for us, and more importantly, is driving outcomes for our children. And I don't think it's dissimilar to the models everybody else has said. But if we're really honest, if you've been a school leader leading a budget, 70 to 80% of your money is taken away by staffing anyway, isn't it? Then they give me 5.5% to do whatever we want to do. So there is there's only a little pot of money to play with. Now, you might make that decision that actually that little pot of money to play with is around centralized control for lots of really good reasons. Or you might go down the route of top slicing, or as some mats make me laugh, call a partnership fee for being part of us. And I think what's really fascinating is, and Rowena and I have long discussions about this, actually there isn't a right or wrong answer. I think there's a right answer for the state of the maturity and situation your trust is in. And I think what is dangerous about this conversation is if you don't review this on a regular basis as your trust develops and grows. And I actually see across a bigger, if we grew to be 50, 60 schools, we would need a very different model in quite a lot of things. And I think it's about that flexibility to change the model at the right time before it's seeing the problems three years ahead of you and how best you manage that. And I think this is fascinating because I'm poles apart from some people in their view of how to run a multi-academy trust. But it's when you become a leader that's so insular that you can't respect the reviews of different people, how they run their trusts.
Yeah.
And I do think if I went to be a CEO of another mat, I might think very differently about the position that mat was in.
Yeah. Well, that's why I suppose, getting everyone on this call and clearly having some different views, but being able to have that debate is healthy and is good. And so one of the follow-up question there is it easy though to change model? Like you're saying that you've got to be able to chop and change, but I mean, is that simple? I can't imagine it's that quick and easy just to flick a switch and go, right, we're going to that model and this model. Does it take so long to do? Is it, you've got to get it right, presumably each time you make any change?
It takes time, it takes consultation. Also, my idea was that actually if it's working and it's proven to be working, then actually it can be a distraction. Our main job here is to make sure children's outcomes, I don't just mean, examination outcomes, that children's outcomes for life are great. Now, actually, if your funding system is getting in the way of those children's outcomes being as good as they can, that it is worth the time and investing in changing. If actually you're confident that your funding model is helping children broad outcomes across a whole range of spectrums, it's fine. You can spend a lot of time. When we did reserve pooling, it was really interesting to see the reactions of some of our academies about well, this is our children's money, and when you've got an academy that might have a reserve of £1 million, okay. Well, it's not the children that are currently in your building now. It's probably their the grandparents of the children in your building now because you've accumulated that. And actually, why is that money not being spent? Mm-hmm. And I think the conversation about reserve pooling was actually more difficult than GAG pooling in a way, because historically people feel that's their money. And this is the move from a multi-academy trust, as Rowena's quite rightly saying, to where we used to have local management of schools and we came, and I think part of the issue around managing estates is really important, because even though you pay a top slice, we do take the pain of estates away from you. We do, in the model we have financial experts. My CFO is a really great person who's worked in capital banks and knows. So I don't think it's a question of if you don't GAG pool, you don't have this. It's about that funding and that ability to make local decisions. Mm-hmm. But I keep going back to this point about, I get the equality thing is really interesting for me, isn't it? What's more important? All my kids in the trust get the amount of money. And if you GAG pool, maybe kids in your schools don't get the same amount of money spent on them. And again, it's working across a large authority, 8 different authority areas. And that's what it comes down to. But it's about making those decisions. Making a change, Dan, is hard. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it's about heart and mind, but it's about where you put your priorities, yeah. I think. And if I am a major fan of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But if it isn't going to get you any better in the next 3 years, then you need to change it.
Yeah. Irina, I didn't know if you were trying to come in then, but I think you were.
I'm always trying to come in, Dan. So your challenge is going to be to stop me from talking about this, because I'm absolutely passionate about it. I mean, the thing is, so it depends on the corporate model that you're adopting. So Wayne has just described a kind of a middle out corporate model where schools own, I think you would use the word, leaders talking about taking from the academy to put the money into the centre. Now, that is one model that we can use in the sector. A more traditional model, which you see in almost every other place in the public sector, and indeed in most areas in the private sector as well, is more of a top-down kind of corporate model. And I take the view that I personally hold a whole amount of accountability for all of the schools in my trust, and that my job is to manage the strategy, the money, and the risk that's associated with that. And actually, I don't see this as the school's money. I see this as money that is calculated for us on the basis of the number of children who are within our schools, within our trust, and as experts within my organisation, which does include absolutely leaders of schools. We have to work out how to get the best bang for our buck out of that global amount of money. So all we're describing here is the same process, but just derived from two different starting points, actually. And my absolute thing that I'll die in a ditch over is that whichever model you adopt, you have to be able to stand behind this full-throatedly and wholeheartedly. And I don't stand behind that model of a strategy being driven from the middle, because I feel that in an organization which has grown very rapidly and has lots of problems it seeks to overcome, that devolution of power into lots and lots of different silos doesn't enable us to achieve transformation at scale. But as Wayne has said, it is horses for courses. It's picking the right strategy for the right time. And I would also just finish by saying, it depends on how belt and braces you want to deliver change as to how long it takes. Because I have run a trust where I was hit with a financial crisis within 6 weeks of starting, where I thought I was going to finish the year with £1 million surplus, and I ended up facing £1 million black hole. I had to move within 6 weeks to a GAG pooling model, and I did it. And lots of people subsequently said to me, how on earth did you manage that? And I think one of the benefits of coming in from outside of the sector is you sometimes don't know what the barriers are until you've crashed through them, got to the other side, and realized that it really wasn't as hard as people imagined it was going to be. Now, I'm not saying that we did that perfectly by any means, but I don't think that, and I certainly think that with a different time and a different amount of time available to me, I might have been more consultative, and people who know me know that that isn't always my great strength. But I do feel that we sometimes get stuck on the amount of time that we worry something's going to take and how hard it's going to be. And sometimes we just need to have a go. And my old boss used to say to me, the best is the enemy of the good. And you can do a really good job at this without it having to be gold plated, and it doesn't have to take the time that you think it might.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that if I could come in there, I think what is great about this sector is learning from different people with different backgrounds. Rowena and I work really well together. Well, I would like to say, she might disagree. And, we talk an awful lot, but we are absolutely poles apart in some ways in which we deliver. So we joke, if we did a job share of a trust, it would be a massive chaos. But actually, what I'm learning, because I have come through a classroom teacher route into this role, is I am learning from colleagues from Marina who are coming in, like Dan, from different sectors to give a different viewpoint. And there's never a time I come away from a conversation with somebody for the different viewpoint doesn't make me question myself. And I think it's when you stop questioning yourself and stop learning. And we are a really immature sector. I don't mean our behaviour, some of us, but the sector hasn't been going very long. If we really think about it, it's still in its infancy, and it's kind of got to that teenage years of angst, and it's a really interesting dilemma. But I think that learning from each other, particularly from people that may come from a different sector, is one of the most beneficial things that I've had from being a CEO, is being a part of a network of people that don't all think like me.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And I think, sorry, very quickly, I was going to say we had a piece on Tes last year, which was like the Matt CEO 2.0 era that we're moving into, as that sort of second generation of Matt CEOs coming in. So to your point, it is a quite a new sector, the new leadership styles. As people like yourself come from the class of people like Rena, come from outside, bringing their different views together, and it is great and healthy that people can debate and discuss and disagree, but more sort of say, well, this is what works for us, this is what's for you. So yeah, it's really healthy to see that, and that's why hopefully people watching this who are having these debates internally and worrying about it, maybe seeing that actually everyone else out there is talking about this and thinking this and thinking that, and disagreeing a bit here and agreeing on that, and everyone fundamentally is going in the same, trying to get the same thing, which is the best for pupils, really. Dan, sorry, you're going to come in there.
Well, just in the sense that I wear both hats. I am a qualified teacher, and I came up through the school-based route, but prior to that worked for a significant period of time in corporate finance and within the private sector world of business. And when I was training, I was initially struck actually in this sector by how important tradition and temperament are to decision making, and I think that should be respected. But trying to apply previous ways of being and methodology to what is effectively an entirely new system, I think can be really problematic. And I think this whole discussion that Rowena was talking about, top down versus middle out, is really important, because I keenly feel the accountability of my role. And I think sometimes if we almost pretend that the accountability sits at different levels when it doesn't, we end up in a little bit of a circular discussion which doesn't out the reality. And the second thing I just wanted to draw attention to is I'm very blessed, I think, actually, to run a trust that's within one local authority of 18 schools. However, my smallest school has got 9 pupils and my largest school has got nearly 1,800. That school with 9 pupils is so vitally important to its local community, but would not be sustained without being part of a wider piece. And I think the social justice argument and the anchoring institution, especially in rural schools. Sorry, my camera's going crazy.
I was going to say, maybe the rural connection perhaps is, as you're discussing. There we go. Yeah.
You know, that is absolutely part of it. We are about to launch a new ICT refresh, so clearly it's needed. But that's exactly the point. I think within a multi-academy trust, you have for us, the equity aspect is just as important as the equality. And for there to be equity and for there to be a very broad range of how we deliver education in this country, we have to look at viability beyond just financial viability. We've got to look to social viability and we've got to look to community viability. And that means actually, because of our GAG pooling and the commitment and values of the principals, they are 100% committed to making sure that our smallest school has absolutely the opportunities to thrive and to survive, actually, in a way that it would not if it were not within this operation. If we didn't GAG pool, honestly, we would all be supporting that school, but it would be done in the ledgers. It wouldn't be done in a meeting where we are being very open and honest and we form and coalesce our commitment and ethos around that decision making in a way that I think is very transparent. And just the last point for me on this one is, I think there's a real direction of travel with GAG pooling. And I think there's almost an inevitability, if I'm frank about this, within the sector that we will all end up with a version of this. But also at the same time, as we're seeing increased academisation, I think it's really important, therefore, with the schools that are joining at this point to be joining with an understanding of the model as it will be, as well as that as it is. Because again, that goes back to the transparency of being very open about our operating model and our direction of travel. Because the last thing we want, whether it be educationally or how we organise the trust overall, is to be in a situation where you have governing boards signing up for something that actually there's already a plan change underneath it that they're maybe not aware of. Because I think that then leads to barriers of alignment and ensuring actually that they are truly welcomed into our family as equals and on an equal footing.
Yeah. An interesting point there about your rural school, which maybe we can come back to briefly. But Sarah, it seems like the conversation has gone a long way on since you were last speaking. But again, was there anything in all that you heard that sort of, made you think, yes, we need to commit to more in that direction, or actually, yeah, it's good to know that everyone is grappling with this as much as we are? Again, there's a lot there, but anything that's all you want to come back on particularly?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an ongoing conversation, and it's a very good point, is how do you want to run your trust? And there's lots of different ways that you can do it and still be really successful, and utilising your money in a way that helps you to achieve that is, partly why we're debating it today, I think. But as far as our regulators are concerned, so if you think about the ESFA, the money belongs to the trust. So how we then allocate that money out is within the gift of your operating model, within your executive team, your board, and with your principals. And there'll be lots of different reasons for doing it one way and not the other. And I think the reason why I am more inclined to think about GAG pooling is because of the potential way that language and communications around things like contributions, and Wayne, you did use the word fee to be part of your trust. I think that is quite challenging language. So if you think about a school being part of a trust, I'd much rather think about one organisation, one trust, all working together for the benefit of our pupils. And if you develop that language and that terminology of it being a charge or a fee to be in your trust, I think that could then lead to individuals in schools not feeling part of one organisation and really buying into it. But I know how embedded that terminology is in the sector. So you talk about top slicing and contributions, and with ambitions for more maintained schools to join trusts, it's one of the things they first ask: what is your top slice? What is your financial model? And can I still manage my budget? So it's definitely something that is highly topical at the moment And I think picking up on earlier conversations, I think Rowena's absolutely right. We have to, if we are going to review, and we do need to review regularly, you can sometimes do that quickly where you need to for external drivers, or sometimes do it a bit more in consultation, a bit more detailed. And I think depending on what the drivers are for that change, you can take it a few different ways, but doing it regularly and taking stock of, is this how we're doing, is what we're doing the right thing, I think is really important.
And I thought, again, that seems to sort of trump what else Rowena said earlier about, like, language and not like the word autonomy. And maybe we just have to be a bit honest with people and say, but this is how it works. This is how it is. But actually, that's not a bad thing. It's a benefit. Yes, you might lose autonomy as you perceive it, but actually you're joining a family of trust. You're going to get supported so many other ways. Again, same with financial models and so forth. It's like, well, of course, it's going to be different. Actually, fundamentally, we're all here to provide great teaching and learning and outcomes for pupils. And if this is the best way to do it, that in this trust, then let's do that. And the very last thing I want to touch on, which is something that, again, Dan, because you mentioned it, and it was something that, again, someone else mentioned about this point about looking 3 years in the future and, planning ahead. And that's something that, in the last sort of 6 months, we've all seen how quickly the world can change. But one thing we do know that's going to happen is a decline in pupil numbers. There's this population, lag that's coming in. And we wrote about it on Tes last year, and it's going to be quite impactful. And again, looking to the future then, and GAG pool, again, Dan, you're talking about a very rural school there, where presumably then in one model, that school could just not be viable. But if it's an important part of a local community, if it serves, if otherwise it means families are going to face hour-long round trips. Again, I saw you do a talk on this into an ethical case for GAG pooling. Presumably that's a kind of perfect example of whereby supporting a school like that in a rural area, that means that the local farmer, and the family can send their pupils to the school down the road, which maybe has existed for 100 years. And we know population is going to go down. Again, there's so many moving parts here, but do you think that kind of is a sort of look into the future where, and your point about the model may become more prevalent, it's those kind of reasons that might drive it?
I think that's spot on. And I think there's two things that underpin where we're going to be in 3 years and what we need to do about it. And it goes to Sarah's point a little bit around language, which is, as multi-academy trusts, I think increasingly we're going from a transactional to the transformational, and really embracing that sense of civic leadership and looking at each of our schools as an anchor institution within communities. And that's incredibly important in our rural communities. And I also think in terms of that whole thing around language, if I'm really blunt about this, I think the generation of head teachers coming in are much less concerned with this. I think there's a change process for more established head teachers who have operated in a certain way and are being asked to operate in a different way. So perhaps this is just part of a change management piece overall, and one that culturally will be less relevant in a few years around those discussions. In terms of what the benefit of being therefore in a trust and the way we operate, that small school of 9 will, from September, have a midwifery provision that will operate from a local authority because of its isolation. And actually that garners a small amount of income in terms of using the school building, but it also opens up some really important health aspects to the local community who would otherwise have to travel for 90 minutes to go to their prenatal and postnatal appointments. Additionally, out of all of the smaller primary schools, we're currently operating them as warm banks for quite elderly and quite impoverished local communities who are also therefore accessing the buildings in a way that is for the greater good. And so I suppose my bigger point for some of our villages is, if you go back 15, 20 years, there would have been a post office, there would have been a pub, there would have been many other aspects of social infrastructure. The one that is left is a school. And if that school goes, there is no social infrastructure left within some of our rural communities. And I think the experience of our country and where this is once something's gone, it doesn't come back. And I think we have a moral and ethical responsibility to keep the fabric of our communities and indeed society together by ensuring that those that, if we just look on a balance sheet or the profit and loss account, might not be the way forward. But actually, when you operate using GAG pooling, that's where you go to where the need is. And sometimes that is social need just as much as it is educational outcome need. And I think all of us on this call, and indeed more broadly in our sector, are at a point where we recognise that we are education leaders, but we are civic leaders and civic players. And to be a civic player, we first and foremost put the needs of our communities first.
Yeah. And Wayne, do you have rural schools, again, across your authority? So is that an issue, this population thing, or is that not a concern to you so much?
No, I mean, we have coastal schools and city schools, but we don't have the rural, the schools that Dan, and I think that emphasizes the idea this isn't an ideology, in my opinion, of whether to GAG pool or not. This is about using the resources and the systems to suit your trust and the particular ways in which you work. So if I did have 2 or 3 rural schools, as Dan suggests, that were at closure failing, we might look at closing, not failing, sorry, closing. We might have a very different view to that, but because we work predominantly either in the city, inner cities, or we predominantly work on the coast where we, you know, predominantly have 2 elementary primaries, large secondaries. That idea, now, if we were a trust that were very different, it shouldn't be about the ideology of Wayne as a leader. It's about the structure in which is best to use your finances. And I think sometimes with some maybe, you know, leaders who came in the sector very early, it was about, you know, my trust was built around one man's vision and the leadership of one man who was brilliant and did a fantastic job. But I think there is something around this idea of it can't be a decision that's made lightly. It has to be a contextually based decision. And I would argue that actually we are all one trust. There is one trust in GAT. I keep saying we are the trust, we are the trust. Everyone's outcomes are important. We're only as good as our weakest school in terms of outcomes. So you can create that thing about being one mat without GAG pooling. It's just not a thing. It's about that system and about where you find, and also the position you find your mat in. If you've got predominantly converters and they converted on this promise of, or if you've got sponsored, we're sponsor led. You know, out of our 38, 32 are sponsored academies. There at some point we're in a category, and I think that's why it's such a nuanced conversation. But I think the issue comes when we've got the ideology of a one leader who believes this is the way, where it isn't suited to the children or the communities you're serving. And I think, you know, to Dan's point, GAG pooling works brilliantly in that area because it is providing that.
Yeah, excellent. Well, unless anyone wants to add a final point, I'm conscious of the time. We talked about a lot there. And one thing I'll note is, because I don't, in the final edit of this, I don't think people will see it, but when Rowena earlier, you said the most important thing really is that you can fully stand behind your model and that you believe in it. Everyone on the panel nodded vigorously at the same time, which I think was evident also in how you all spoke about the models you're using and thinking about changing it. And so I think hopefully, I really appreciate how open and candid everyone's been and sort of had that, difference of opinion, but also actually often coming at it with the same desire of outcome. So I really appreciate that. And I'm sure everyone watching who's probably grappling with many of these discussions, having the same debates, looking for reassurance, looking for other ways of thinking, we're going to really appreciate it too. So if we were in a real life conference hall, I expect everyone would give you a round of applause now. I'll have to just assume they're going to do it digitally. But thank you so much for taking part in this leadership forum with Tes. Really appreciate that. And look forward to, if people see you at events, no doubt I'm sure they're happy to come up and chat to you more about it. And otherwise, I'll just say thank you on behalf of our audience. And that's been great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.